but it's the grace of God that holds back his wrath. And that's because Christ satisfied God the Father with his payment. God is so good, and not just to us, but especially to us.
You are always only good.
So let's look at the topic here. Go ahead and turn to, in case you haven't got Titus bookmarked in your computer or your Bible, go ahead and open it to, so we're talking about transitions, successions and transitions. This is where I spend about 80% of my ministry time now, is either helping churches plan a retirement, find a replacement, everything. Many of your constitutions do not yours, but everyone's, do not address a church without a pastor who is in charge. How do you call an interim? If you want an interim, you address pulpit committees, but really, they're very, especially churches with a single pastor, who is really in charge if there's not a senior pastor? So that's something to think about. But anyway, so transitions, this is the life I live, okay? So again, any questions along the way, be sure and stop. I'm fixing to play a video. I think you see here on the introduction, Every Pastor is an Interim Pastor. That's the book Next, N-E-X-T, which I advise you to get a copy. You read it long before you think about transitioning. You give it to your deacons to read. It's an easy read. And there are other good ones out there. I think this is just an easy read. The negative is it cites a lot of large churches on the transition, but the principles still apply. But a lot of the other books I've read, you get lost in the weeds, and this one keeps it at a level that most of your deacons would read. All right, now, some of you, if you've heard me do this, I've done this at Arch a couple of times. There's a video regardless. Now, this is not the same presentation I do at Arch, but there's a video I'll start with. And you won't remember anything else I say today. You won't. But you will remember the video. And I can tell you where I was the first time I saw it played. Okay, here we go.
I want to, in this worship segment, demonstrate a biblical principle using music. Here's the biblical principle. You're going to do your best work and ministry, and then you're going to die. That's the biblical truth. You're going to play your best song before the Lord, and then in time you have to slide off the bench, and another person will come and keep the music of God going. But you, my friend, are expendable, and you are going to die. But the music of God will go on. Now, I'm going to ask Dave Talbot, who has been the program director, the floor manager. I'm going to ask him to come up here, and he has no idea I'm going to do this. So just come up here, Dave Talbot. This is completely spontaneous. You can tell from last night, I'm a rather improvisatory man, a spontaneous man. And this is what we're going to do. I've not spoken to Dave about this at all. I just know he's a good pianist because I've heard him at Mount Hermon and other places. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask Dave to sit down and just start playing a commonly known hymn or chorus. And when I feel like it, I'm just going to take it from him. And he's going to slide off this bench and just stand behind me like he is now. And then when he feels like it, he'll take it back from me. And what I want to show is that the music goes on, although the players change. You're going to do your best work. And when it is time to finish, you're going to slide off the bench. If you do it right, the music will keep on. Your organization will not die because you die, if you do it correctly. Amen.
All right. This is a short one because we're late, Richard.
All right, so there you go. You won't remember anything else I say, but you'll remember that video. And I saw it at a mission board transition, and I said, I got to have that. So as a pastor, that was etched in my mind that, okay, there's a time we're going to finish, okay, and who's going to take your place? So if you look at the overview of Titus, again, this is just something to think about. This is just a quick assessment. I'm not getting into everything you men are doing. But really, when you think about it, there was a self-assessment in 1 through 4. And then there's a church assessment. So, right, Titus was left. And then there's a ministry of preaching and teaching. Sound doctrine that transforms relationship within the church, 1 through 8. And then outside the church, 9 through 15. And then notice, ministry of preparation, preparing the church to reach the community, 1 through 11. And I think the highlight of Titus 3 is verse 8. This is a faithful saying, these things which I commit or affirm constantly, they which have believed in God, be careful to maintain good works. And that's all that preaching being lived out. And then notice the next thing, 12 through 15. Titus is gone. Now, I use this when we have our interim conferences. I say, okay, this is what an interim must do. When an interim comes in, you got to assess the church. Okay, and you got to figure out, okay, what relationships within the church are wrong, outside the church. Is the church, how can you help them prepare reach community? And then you're gone. But in a lot of ways, I sit there and look at that. That was my ministry as a pastor for 20-something years, when you think about it. So all I'm saying is there is I think Titus gives us a picture, but what I want to think about at the end, Titus is gone. Okay, he's gone. And so are we, in one way or another. So as we look through this, so I got 2 passages I want you to look at. And then I'm going to ask you what they have in common. This is the prayer of Moses. And notice that the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, which set before them may go in before them, which may lead them out, and which may bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like what? I know you're tired and I know you're sleepy. Go get another coffee. It may not be like what? Sheep which have no shepherd. And look at this. So what was the prayer of Jesus? When he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion because they fainted and they were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers. We quote 37 and 38, but oftentimes we forget to back up to verse 36. So what do the prayer of Moses and the prayer of Jesus have in common? What can we take away from these 2 prayers?
They failed.
Pardon me?
They failed.
Okay, they failed. Okay. All right. What would be some other takeaways of that?
Concern for the sheep.
Exactly. We got to have a concern for the sheep. A concern for the sheep. And churches without under shepherds are vulnerable. They don't do well. I'm telling you, this is where I live. And how many churches? I mean, the churches in your area don't have pastors. Give them my email. I mean, we'll see. We don't have any interims available at the moment. All 17 are taken. But we just got a man back who was teaching in India. He may be available. I don't know. But anyway, send them. But what I'm trying to say is, if you're currently pastoring, you have a chance to do something about that now. Okay, but the key is churches without under shepherds are vulnerable. So that's what we need to continue to think through. Now, you see the note under prayer. You should pray for future pastors, for your congregation. Notice the next one, what? I gave you the testimony of my pastor in Clemson when I was called to preach. Oh, by the way, yeah, we've been praying for that for a couple of years. Okay. So we need to pray you need to be praying for your successor, and maybe even from within. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, number 2, the promise. We covered this last night. That's Matthew 16. The promise is what? I will build my church. And it's just a reminder that when I teach this and don't do the session we covered last night, it's just a reminder, it's not your church, you're the overseer. And Christ is building his church. And again, but we need to do our part in planning for that. And again, the process, you know this as well. We went through this, the calling, the equipping. Again, 2 Timothy 2:2, I think that's so important as we recognize who to mentor, those that will be able to teach others also. Because as a steward, if you're like me, you have invested in men that weren't worth the investment, if I can put it that way. But you don't know that when you start. But when you realize that, you got to say, okay, how much longer am I going to go here? And then just a few verses here at the ending, the approving, and I think this is important, and you know this because you're local church guys. Acts 13, when they had fasted and prayed, laid their hands on them and sent them away. This I charge to commit unto thee, son Timothy, and this is Paul, with the laying on of hands of the presbytery, lay hands suddenly on no man. 2 Timothy 1:6, wherefore I put thee in remembrance that I have stirred the gift of God which is in thee, putting on of my hands. And they ordained elders in every city as they had need. There is a public recognition of the men that you are calling, the men the church is calling. I would challenge you as you pray through that you challenge men, it's obviously being done in this group, to train in some way for ministry. And I would challenge you to get men ready to be ordained. So your church has both the responsibility and the privilege of ordaining them, because with that you become attached to them, and a responsibility and accountability for their future ministry. But ordination is a big deal. And let me get off another one. Polity is a big deal. So we are assisting a church. Pastor or pastors resigned. The one pastor that was on staff was called and hired by the senior pastor as a budget approval, but the church never voted on him. Okay, so what kind of polity issues do you now run into when the lone pastor was never voted on and called by the church? He was called by the pastor. So what happens? That's a question. What would be your recommendation to the church? Does he have the authority to preach? Does he have the authority to administer the Lord's Supper in this local church? So all of the way we practice this makes a difference. Okay, and you follow what I'm trying to say? Did I make it clear? You got any suggestions on what this church should do? So I am an advocate, polity-wise, that if there's another pastor coming on staff, that he is examined by the church as well as, you need to vet him. I'm not saying you can skirt you, but you need to vet him. But he needs to be examined by the church, and I think called by the church. Therefore, he is called and recognized by that local church as an elder, overseer, pastor, under shepherd, right? And therefore, he has the authority, if needed, to, if something happens to one of the other pastors. Does that make sense? And maybe y'all do this, okay? I'm just saying this is where polity makes a difference, and your view of ecclesiology and the laying on of hands and examining of elders makes a big difference in the church. Any comment there? All right.
Question?
Sure.
Is it common? In circles that I have, I don't see that happen a lot. But is that pretty common? The pastor calls somebody and they join him and the church doesn't really have any say?
Let me tell you how it gets common. It goes in the budget. We really need to go ahead and get this guy in here. And I really like him. I know he's the next guy. And do we really want to put the church through this examination? You know, you've heard him preach. Can't I do it? You follow me? So for some reason it gets short-circuited. And all right, so do most churches trust their senior pastor? Yeah. And so he says, well, we'll take care of it later. It never happens. Okay. I want us to look at the other side. That happens. But there was the old theology, or not theology, the old practice of, is he an associate pastor or an assistant to the pastor? You remember that language? So the assistant to the pastor was hired by the pastor to be his assistant. An associate pastor was usually an ordained man that the church called and vetted. Okay, I think that's usually the difference. Okay, and I think the assistant to the pastor may have been a different view of leadership within the church, where you had a big B Baptist, if I can use that, where the big P pastor was the big P Pope, right? And that was the way the Bruce, did I say something? Bruce back there cracking up. All right, so that was kind of the way that took place. But all those do have consequences. Okay, especially when it comes to transitions, either by death, resignation, disqualification. Okay, because I mean, not all pulpits are open because it was a nice retirement and everything ended well. That's great, but that's not the way everything ends. Okay, and so let me say this: as y'all have fellowships, you can help churches think through this if they haven't thought through it. Okay. All right. So the bottom line is, I believe God is calling young men to preach. And I think God is still saving people. The question is, do we get to be a part of it? Are we doing our part to get to participate in it? Is the question. All right, any questions before we get into number 4? Because I want to spend some other time. All right, so I think there is a planning. And I'm not going through all the verses. You can look them up, but I mentioned this last night, I think. So I think definitely planning is biblical. I think it's personal. You have to do it. It must be accompanied by faith and by prayer, both. It should be ongoing. You know, Paul planned to go back to Corinth, but then God redirected his steps. And here's the point I want to say. You must plan for your successor. I'm not saying you handpick him. There's a difference. But please don't be the pastor that hangs on so long that the deacon has to come to you and say, we think it's time you need to retire. I think, Bruce, and you can quote me how you say it, some guys, they're hanging on and they're going to die and the church is going to die with them. Is that the way you say it, Bruce? Something close to that. Don't be that man. I was with one man, he says, well, I've got this much longer, and the church has this much money in savings, and I need to stay for these number of years, and the church we can live off our savings. So you younger guys, you've got to plan now for your retirement. And the financial package is another whole thing. And again, in my world as an interim, when we interview interims, I got to talk about their finances. Because in interim, you can't count on interim pay to meet all your needs. It's kind of the gravy, right? But I can tell you many men that would say you can't afford to be an interim because you've got to go get a full-time job somewhere because they opted out of Social Security. All right, let's take the other side. They probably were in a small work, lived in a parsonage all their life, and sacrificially served the church, right? Okay, that's a true picture, right? The negative side of that picture is, at the same time they were doing all that, and probably sacrificed, put the kids in Christian school, and maybe in Christian colleges. But now it's time, the church, he needs to retire. They bought into opting out of Social Security. That's your conscience. Let me say this. I've met 2 men that opted out that put the money back. Money ain't a problem for them. But that's only 2. Well, I was going to put it back. I was waiting to inherit. But what I'm saying, don't be the one that becomes a burden to others. Okay, especially younger ones. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, there's a point here that you don't want the leadership, and this is hard discussion. You want to be the one to initiate in some way your exit plan. Nobody remembers how you came, or very few. Everybody will remember how you leave. Okay? And you want to leave the church in good shape instead of draining it because you can't afford to leave. Any questions there? This is a hard conversation, right? See, Bruce gets the easy ones, I get the hard ones. All right, practical. What should you do? You should prepare yourself and your family. Transition to a ministry and not from a ministry. Your transition will be a very emotional time for you and your wife. I will tell you, on August the 1st, 2017, my wife looked, all right, so our last day with the church was July 31st, 2017. I had a great time, new pastors installed. I started with GFA on August the 1st, 2017. My wife looked at me and she said, "Who am I?" And my wife and I, we're a team. We do everything together. We plan the church together. We counsel together. We usually travel together. But I will never forget when she looked at me and said, "Can you please tell me who I am?" Because her identity for counseling, for Bible studies, for speaking was always, my husband's the pastor at Harvest Baptist Church. She was a pastor's wife. And that gave her a standing with other pastors' wives. So now, part of my ministry, my wife's ministry, if you're planning retirement, I'm going to say, "Hey, can you and your wife, can we do a phone call together?" And we're going to say, "Get ready, it's coming." Okay? So you got to prepare your family, especially your wife. And then you're going to wake up and say, "Who am I?" Okay? What am I doing? Continually remind yourself the church you pastor belongs to Jesus and not you. Read next. D, everyone should remember how you left, not how you came. Okay, so I've already said it. All right, look at number 2. Prepare your church's leadership and congregation. Use your annual budget, your annual financial plan to cast a vision to mentor men for ministry, interim, part-time staff, full-time staff. Your successor may be a former interim or intern. So please do that. We got advice on our transition, and we said, okay, so I plan like a 30-month transition, which is a slow death, by the way, in case you ever plan it that long. It's a slow death. It's a good handoff, but it's a slow death. So anyway, so I put the plan out there. I said, okay, so my son who took my spot was a youth pastor. I said, we need to bring in a youth pastor. So Marshall then can take over more of the pastoring side of things and be a smooth handoff. And I said, okay, we can take the money out of savings. So we presented a vision. We presented this to the church. We'll take the money out of savings to pay for this next staff member for the next 2 years, right? Well, the church bought into it so much that the church giving went up, and we never had to take the money out of savings. But there was a plan in place. So this man became the youth pastor, and my son moved into like a true associate's role, although the church had voted on him. And then we went from there. But it's very good advice we got from that. And we used the financial plan to cast that vision. Okay, in the budget we used that. We used our goals that we put out. I remember so I do, let me see, where do I have that? Number B, 2B, use your church's goals to communicate your transition. And we talked about this. Goals can be immediate, short-term, long-term. These are not inspired. This is not business by objectives. This is casting a vision for the church. Can I say that again? It's casting a vision. And so when you put in your, if you do this annual business meeting, you put in your plans that in 5 years I want to be replaced. And your people are going to look at you, why would you do that? And then 5 years later they said, we are so glad you did that. But you don't have to drop the bomb on them all at one time. You can do it along the way. Does that make sense? Okay. C, everyone read that. D, evaluate your church, give an accurate assessment of the state of your church. You can do this yourself, with these 5 areas. Evaluate your church. Find out really what is the state of your church, so you will help the next guy know the state of your church. As a candidate comes in, it will give them, or if it's from without, it will give them a fair view of the state of what they're getting into. Okay, so you can do it yourself. One of your other pastor friends can do it. I'll be happy to do it. But it just gives a view from the outside. And not only that allows the candidate to adjust better to the church because he knows what he's getting into. And he understands that, let's just say you got $300,000 in savings and $250,000 of that is designated and he can't touch it. And all of a sudden, he didn't know that till he got into the church, and all of a sudden he realized, no, this church is strapped for finances, and here I thought that they could pay all the bills, or whatever. You follow me? Help them know what's coming. And you guys are falling asleep, so I got to do something to keep you awake. Things you could do. Give Sunday night pulpit to a younger staff member. Use summer internships to equip and prepare the next generation. Use 1 to 2 internships to equip and prepare the next generation. Now, I am an advocate of giving Sunday nights away at some point. But tell me the negatives of that. What are some negatives you're going to hear if you attempt to do this? To either an intern or your associate pastor. Or a deacon in training, okay?
My in-laws' church. The pastor said, well, let's do Sunday nights, have this guy preach. He's coming up. So the congregation says, well, since you're not preaching Sunday nights, maybe we should pay you less.
All right, now let's address it. There is, if that's the attitude of the congregation, then you may have a reputation of not being a diligent worker. And that would be bad. Well, but if he was a hard worker, and that was the congregation's attitude, and they thought I was a hireling, my philosophy of ministry somewhere did not penetrate their hearts, and we never meshed. Okay. But I know one church that truly the guy was out of the pulpit every 4th week. Okay, get your vacation plan out. Okay, and I mean, I'm all for adequate vacation for pastors, right? But there's so many Sundays you can be out of the pulpit. After that, we need to talk. Okay, but that shouldn't be the standard. Okay, but what would be some other negatives you're going to hear if you propose this? Or possible negatives? Come put on your thinking cap. What would you hear?
Sunday night attendance will drop.
Yep, okay. And why would that be?
That he's not as competent as a senior pastor.
Yeah, we want to hear good preaching, and this guy isn't as good. No, that's the number one you're going to hear. What may be some others? You're the pastor. You're under shepherd. I want to hear you. Okay. All right. So how would you, if this is your burden? And let me say it this way: my burden is to train the next generation. Okay. I mean, that's my burden, has been. I want to make sure we are doing all we can on local church to make sure whether he stays with us or he goes elsewhere, that the young men know how to preach, they know how to baptize somebody, they know how to serve the Lord's table. So, like me, the first baptism I did, I had no idea what I was doing. Wait a minute. I got to figure out Lord's Supper. I'd never served the Lord's Supper, right? Okay, so we want to make sure, and that's not negative against my pastor, so I want to make sure that's my fault, it's his. What I'm trying to say. But that shouldn't be the norm, right? All right, so how if our vision is to, if we're always training others for ministry, You could start, okay, 2 Sundays a month, I'm going to give it to, Pastor Dan or whoever, and he'll be bringing the Sunday night, because this is what we want to do as a church. We have the opportunity to mentor him and to train him, because we want him either to preach here or somewhere else. So you almost got to consider an opportunity. I'm saying you got to sell it, but you got to live out your philosophy. Okay? Does that make sense? It may not work, okay, right? Can we say it again? It might not work. Are we being honest? It might not. So if it doesn't work, you need to go back and help this young man learn how to preach. So it may be some other mentoring on that side you need to do. All right? But you could give away Sunday night, so you could develop a series. And then if you do that, and that does kick in, then your sermons get better and his sermons get better. You can devote more time to prayer. You can devote more time to study. Okay? All right, look at the next one. Use summer internships to equip and prepare the next generation. Use 1 or 2 internships. Okay, so you can do that. Now, there are several podcasts I got listed there. Most of these are done with Bruce, because this is the world he's lived in, church staffing for 40 years. So, when is it time to retire? When is it time to close your church? When is it time to some type of transition? How do you retire? How do you do that? I love this quote. It's in Next. Effective leaders plan ahead for the time when they can no longer lead, and they will prayerfully prepare for that day. Okay? Now, I am not a hockey player, so please understand what I'm about to say. But I was always told great hockey players skate to where the puck will be and not where it is. Great athletes can prepare of where they should be to anticipate what's coming. But we don't. So plan ahead. I think it's in Next, one of the other books, that your leadership is proven after you leave, not while you're there. Your leadership is proven after you leave and not while you're there. But I do like this. Effective leaders plan ahead for the time when they can no longer lead. All right, this is just kind of my history. So Bruce mentioned I was in the business world. So the business I was in started in 1851. All right, so there was this thing called the War of Northern Aggression. Anybody ever heard of that war? You heard of that? Okay. So this business lived through that, lived through Sherman's troops coming through, and literally we had the only safe in town. They blew open the safe, even when it wasn't locked. That's a secondhand story from my grandmother, who heard it from her grandmother. Okay, but forget the southern northern thing. But you think about the transitions in our country from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean conflict, all the way to when I was called to preach and we sold the business in 1993. Okay. So I was sitting down with my grandfather and my grandma. I said, so how has this thing lasted so long? And this is what my grandfather said. He said, well, the bottom line is the previous generation kind of let us do what we were interested in the business. And this is what he meant. Pre-World War II, in the South, you had almost like general stores, So pre-World War II, we sold everything from fishing equipment to sporting goods, to Bibles, to books, to school books, to, whatever the hardware store didn't sell. Basically, the feed and seed store sold, and what they didn't sell, we did. But post-World War II, everything started getting very specialized. Sporting goods stores opened, specialty bookstores opened. The government started providing books for the schools versus buying it privately. And so each generation tweaked, and they did what they preferred to do in the certain area of business. I say that because the next guy is not going to be just like you. That's where I'm going with this. And so business-wise, that survived 150-something years because the latter generation didn't hang on so long. They let the younger generation get involved and get their hands on the business soon enough to where they wanted to stay with the business. Okay, does that make sense? So that's just a lesson I learned from just listening to our family history. The point is, the previous generation, and I don't think any of these, all these men died while being part owners of the business, but they had planned ahead, from my understanding. Okay? So when you look at this further, this is the book Next. Okay? And there are others. Has anybody read another one they really like other than Next? Passing the Baton is one. Anybody got another one they really like you can throw out there? That's Next, or NEXT, Pastoral Succession That Works, by Vanderbloemen and Bird. And it may be, is it in your notes? Yeah, it's in your notes. Yes.
From the man's standpoint, Before You Move by John Cianca.
Yeah.
Cionca. So it's a Baker book.
It's been republished many times, right, Bruce?
I'm sorry. The first one was Red Light, Green Light,
Yeah.
Concerning His Unprotected Misery. And it was redone, retitled. Original was Baker, became Cradle. It's out, probably out of print now, but you can find a copy on Amazon. Before You Move by John Cianca. A church could take that and read it from their standpoint and get information, but especially for the men.
Yep. So I think this is just one way you can prepare, okay, is I think you need to read it. And by the way, and your wife needs to read it, okay? In fact, they point out in their book, the most important relationship between the outgoing pastor and the incoming pastor is not the pastor, it's the pastor's wives. It's their relationship, is what they point out. Now again, many of their illustrations are much larger churches, but you take those same principles and apply them to ours as well, okay? All right, that's just one thing you can do. Now, another thing, if you're near retirement, again, I will unashamedly advertise for this. There is this thing called the interim pastor program, because this is what happens. When you want to go elk hunting, I'm not available during that time. I can go elk hunting. But at the same time, you have the experiences God has brought you, and you really can help a church. And most of the guys that I know, they do this until they're about 80. And that's when they retire the second time. But I'm talking very fruitful ministry of helping a church. And the average interim now is just lasting about 18 in our world. Now, of course, there's some shorter, but it's just how long it takes. So some churches have been hurt. Either something happened and the church was really hurt. And it takes a while to get the church ready, because sometimes the worst thing a church can do is call a pastor before they are ready for a pastor. And this is where an interim can come in, and the interim's wife. We have two men that are widowers, and both of them sat down, we interviewed, and they looked at me and they looked at the committee and they said, "Hey, my wife passed away. Can God still use me?" So if your spouse, because where does a single pastor, widow, where he's a widower, where can he serve? I got news for you. There are plenty of churches that would love to have him as their interim pastor. And it's ideal to have a wife, don't get me wrong. But this is a ministry to consider when you are getting ready to retire. You need to retire to something. Maybe it's volunteer teaching and training men. Maybe it's something. But if you don't retire to something, you're going to regret it. Now, I love to play golf, but I can't play golf. I can't imagine playing golf more than once a week. Well, I can imagine that. I'll take that back. I can't imagine. But not all the time, right? And so there are many years, because we will stand before the Lord. So if the Lord has called you into vocational ministry, why do we just retire and do nothing? Okay? At least you do is get on the phone and encourage pastors. You can do something. But I just want, as you work towards this, because you've got to have that goal out there at some point, and you need to be aware of where that is. Because it's very sad to go into a church. I mean, I was with one church, and I want to tell you the state, but the pastor one of the leaders asked the pastor to call, so he did. I got there. He was so hard of hearing, he couldn't even follow the songs. And so I went and talked to him. I said, brother, what is there, you know why I'm here, to talk about retirement. What would you think be the number one excuse why men don't retire? Money. And I said, financially. He said, I got plenty of money. I said, really? He said, oh yeah, our kids even have a lot. We're ready to build a house. So I'm saying, okay. Why not? Well, no, I just love pastoring. I said, I got that. But let's look at the congregation. You can't even hear the music. So, Bruce is the good cop, right? So I'm the bad cop. But this is with a church leader with me. I would never say that without one. So, but it was so sad. It was terrible. Because the church was down to 11 people. Paid for building, debt free, money in the bank. But they're dying. And the church was dying with him. Don't let that be you. All right. So the interim pastor ministry, you can do that because, again, churches without pastors are vulnerable. Okay. I left this session a lot of time for Q&A. What you got input besides wanting to go get a cup of coffee? Because I'm with you. I need a nap too. Okay. We got 10 minutes. What ideas you got on transitions? Are you good? Yes, Ted.
You know of a church where the pastor was considering retiring, but wanted to bring on the next pastor and stay on for a couple of years. How does that transition really work well if they haven't actually prepared like you're talking about?
All right, I think several things, and Bruce, feel free to comment. Number one, there needs to be an end date in writing. Can I say that again? And the church, is an end date in, can I say this again? Because here's what happens. Next guy comes in, they start sharing responsibilities. The older guy gets energy. Oh, this is great. The church starts growing because energy is coming into the church. Man, this is great with co-pastors. And he goes, and this is a true story. So he goes to my friend and says, you know what? I decided, I don't think I'm going to retire. And my friends calls me and I said, oh no. Now, they had a godly deacon board who was willing to go and sit down and say, you know what, brother? No, we agreed to this at this time, and we want to send you off in a good way. Okay? But it needs to be in writing. It needs to be a date set and not too long. I think I've heard Bruce, hadn't I heard you say that sometimes that transition period goes too far? Hadn't I heard you say that along the way?
2 years is a long time.
Yeah.
It's real tricky. There's a lot of, I wrote an article on transition tips for retiring pastors. Some of that information will be in there. It's on the GFA website. But a lot of personality factors.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of a possessive kind of person. I don't know.
It's hard.
And probably, just as a courtesy, the retiring pastor or the pastor who's stepping down from being senior pastor should, depending on everything, I think it'd be healthy if he and his wife just pulled away for 3 months or 6 months and just let them, when the time is right.
Yeah.
And then let the new man.
Yeah. So the next question is, when you transition out, do you stay in the church? Okay, that's a biggie. That is a huge
I
question.
thought that's what he was asking.
I'm following up with
Okay.
that.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so the way, I'm just going to tell you the way I did it. And I make a lot of mistakes. Okay. Now, is my son following, my oldest son following me? I had 3 trusted men in the church, godly men, deacons. And I sat down with each one of them individually and said, look, I don't want to hurt the church, but I love the church. Do you think I can stay around? Unanimously, not just a silent, not a quiet no, but I mean like with bold print, exclamation point, no. You can't do that. Okay? All right, so here's what does that hurt? You baptize their kids. You do weddings for them. You bury them or their spouses, right? Does that hurt? Yeah. And so in my world, you say, okay, Lord, I know. And the reason we put our transition plan in place was because people were coming after my son to be their senior pastor. And I said, whoa, stop. Because if you leave, that means I got to mentor somebody all over again. And I was in the 60s at this point. So anyway, and so I said, okay, I got it. So I just started praying, Lord, I don't know what I can do. And so I remember praying on a Monday morning, Lord, I know Gretchen, I need to leave. We're aware of that. But Lord, I don't know. Do I go take another church? Do I take a church for like 5 or 6 years? And then you tell your people you're retiring, but by the way, I'm going to take another church. And they're going to say, why did you ever leave? Right? And then in my life, my friend Bruce McAllister calls me later on that Monday morning and said, hey, there's an opening at GFA to help American churches. Would you be willing to come? And I would serve with Bruce on the GFA board. But what I'm saying is that's what worked in my life. But I remember I can't stay. But guess what? In August. So 2 years ago, I called my 3 friends because they always said, we'll let you know when it's okay. And so 2 years ago, they called all of them and said, hey, come on back. We're ready for you. And then I took an interim. But we did just get back in August. Because all it would take would one sideways look at a business meeting by me. Okay? Because my wife, our family replanted the church. That's all it would take. And and the church belongs to Jesus and not to me. But I remember, we can't stay. What do we do? So you plan. You plan. Okay? And then if you stay in the church, it's going to bring up some dynamics that need to be really thought through. I'll leave it there. All right.
Assistant pastor, and his preaching is like better for the new generation coming up. So they like his preaching better than the original.
Okay, you mean okay. So what happens to the church at that point? Okay, I say number one, if I'm the senior pastor and I know this, I'm gonna rejoice. And we'll try to work something out and talk it through. But you don't want, maybe you need to sit down with your leadership that can lovingly and say, I need you to tell me the truth. Do you think the church would be better with assistant pastor than me? And if so, my wife and I want the best for this church. Because we are shepherds, we're not hirelings. Okay. That's one way you can do it. But the whole thing is, so everything I've talked about so far, you have got to have a great relationship with some godly men in your church that can sit down and talk to you in a loving, godly, man-to-man church leadership way that understand the bigger picture for the church. Does that make sense? And that just doesn't happen overnight. That's got to be developed. So if you don't have that now, you need to get to know your deacons and you need to love them and other men in the church. If you have retired pastors in the church, make them some of your counselors. Okay?
You moved to another church and they obviously knew you were a seasoned and retired pastor. How did that dynamic work?
Well, actually, I went back to the church where I was called to preach from. Okay? And Ted had served on staff there. They had been through some pretty rough orders, some transitions. So actually we came in the pastor asked us immediately, will you start counseling? Will you start helping? And again, I'm just getting involved with GFA. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. So hopefully you've got a relationship with other churches that want you to help them. So but that was unique because I went back to where the church that sent me out. Okay. But I would say if I would talk to the pastor in a local area and just say, and the other thing you can do is let your name be known through fellowships. Hey, my wife and I are available for pulpit supply. You need to take a vacation, you get sick on a Sunday, whatever, you're available to travel. And we got 1 minute and 44 seconds. But we got a Q&A time. Right, Mark? Q&A time, or Tim, that's tonight, right? Okay. All right. Yes.
You ever seen the situation where the senior and assistant?
Yeah, I have. And in fact, I need to do a podcast on that. If I didn't already, I can't even remember. I've done so many. But the question is, have I seen one where the older guy steps to the associate role and the associate role steps to, yeah, in fact, I just did, in fact, I preached the message. A young man that's called to preach out of our church took the senior pastor of a good friend of Bruce of mine, a guy named Dale Cunningham. And so Dale went down to the assistant level, and his son-in-law came in as a senior pastor, and he's probably 33. Great kid, and and that's so far. But Dale's gone. Bruce, do you know how long? 6 months? But there's a season they agreed, get away, stay away, okay, and then come back. And they kept him on salary, but they changed salaries. Okay, so the position, they didn't keep because there was a discussion. Well, we think the older pastor still needs to get the higher salary because he's older. And they called me. I said, no, he's no longer the senior pastor. You want to drive. So anyway. All right, we're out of time. All right, so how am I?